page 27. Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, by David Benatar, 2006. Chapter 1. 1.3. Outline of the book. In the remainder of this introduction I shall provide an outline of the rest of the book and offer some guidelines to readers. The second and third chapters constitute the heart of the book. In Chapter 2 I shall argue that coming into existence is always a harm. To do this, I shall show first that coming into existence is sometimes a harm, a claim which ordinary people would readily embrace but which must be defended against a famous philosophical challenge. The argument that coming into existence is always a harm can be summarized as follows: both good and bad things happen only to those who exist. However, there is a crucial asymmetry between the good and the bad things. The absence of bad things, such as pain, is good even if there is nobody to enjoy that good, whereas the absence of good things, such as pleasure, is bad only if there is somebody who is deprived of these good things. The implication of this is that the avoidance of the bad by never existing is a real advantage over existence, whereas the loss of certain goods by not existing is not a real disadvantage over never existing. In the third chapter one argue that even the best lives are not only much worse than people think but also very bad. To this end, I shall argue first that life's quality is not the difference between its good and bad. Determining a life's quality is a much more complicated matter. I shall then discuss three views about the quality of life via hedonistic views, desire fulfillment views, and objectivist views, and show why life is bad irrespective of which of these views one adopts. Finally, in this chapter, I shall describe the world of suffering that we inhabit and argue that this suffering is one of the costs of producing new people. The arguments in the third chapter thus provide independent grounds even for those who are not persuaded by the arguments in the second chapter to accept the claim that coming into existence is always a serious harm. In the fourth chapter one shall argue that not only is there no duty to procreate but there is a moral duty not to procreate. This appears to conflict with the widely recognized right to procreative freedom. I shall examine this right and its possible foundations, arguing that it is best understood as a legal right and not a moral one. Thus there is no necessary conflict with a moral duty not to produce children. I then turn to the question of disability and wrongful life. I shall consider various disability rights arguments and show how my views, curiously, both lend support to these arguments against their usual opponents, but in the end undermine the views of both disability rights and their opponents. Next I shall turn to the implications of my views for assisted and artificial reproduction, before concluding with a discussion about whether producing children treats them as mere means. In the fifth chapter, I shall show how combining typical pro-choice views about fetal moral status with my conclusions about the harm of coming into existence produces a pro-death view of abortion. More specifically, I shall argue that if fetuses at the earlier stages of gestation have not yet come into existence in the morally relevant sense, and coming into existence is always a harm, it would be better if we aborted fetuses in those earlier stages. Along the way I shall distinguish four kinds of interest and ask which of these is morally significant. I shall discuss the question of when consciousness begins, and then defend my and pro-choice views about abortion against the most interesting challenges, those of Richard Hare and Don Marquis. The sixth chapter will examine two related sets of questions, those about population and those about extinction. The population questions are questions about how many people there should be. The extinction questions are questions about whether future human extinction is to be regretted and whether it would be worse if human extinction would come earlier rather than later. My answer to the population question is that there should, ideally, be no more people. However, I shall consider arguments that might allow a phased extinction. In answering the extinction question, I shall suggest that although extinction may be bad for those who precede it, particularly those who immediately precede it, the state of human extinction itself is not bad. Indeed, I shall argue that it would be better, all things being equal, if human extinction happened earlier rather than later. In addition to these arguments of general interest, I shall also show how my views solve many well-known problems in moral theorizing about population size. Here the focus will be on Part 4 of Derek Parfit's book, Reasons and Persons, showing how my views can solve the A non-identity problem, avoid the A absurd conclusion and the A mere addition problem, and explain A asymmetry. In the concluding chapter one shall discuss a number of issues. I shall consider the question whether the implausibility of my conclusions counts against my arguments, and I shall argue against the optimistic insistence that I must be wrong. I shall demonstrate that my arguments are not as incompatible with religious thinking as many people might think. I shall examine questions about death and suicide. More specifically, I shall argue that one can think that coming into existence is always a harm without having to think that continuing to exist is always worse than death. Thus death may be bad for us even if coming into existence is also bad. It follows that suicide is not an inevitable implication of my view, even though it may be one possible response, at least in some cases. Finally, the conclusion will show that although the antinatal view is philanthropically motivated, there are very compelling misanthropic arguments for the same conclusion. Page 29.